Okay, so yeah, we've been getting a lot of questions about the impact of everything that's been happening since Trump's reelection,
Mm-hmm.
specifically on U.S. tourism.
Hmm.
And you guys sent in so much stuff, like tons of reports and polls and all sorts of travel data, and it's honestly a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, it really speaks to how significant this all is.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things that's really striking right off the bat is just the potential scale of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes sense because, the US has always been well, it's always been a major player in global tourism, right? I mean,
Right.
consistently ranked, among the top 3 most visited countries, and you can totally see why.
Yeah, for sure. When you think about all the iconic destinations, places like Times Square, the Majesty of the Grand Canyon, the Hollywood sign.
Exactly.
These are bucket list items for people all over the world.
Yeah, exactly. And the numbers really bear that out. I mean, just looking at 2023, the US had a whopping 66.5 million tourists.
Wow.
And the projection was for that to keep growing in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like it was just going up and up.
Right.
But then with all this information you sent, it's like, uh, it really makes you wonder, could these recent political and policy changes actually like reverse that trend?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, and like what kind of early signals are we seeing in 2025 that might give us a clue about what's to come? Because this isn't just about like hotels and airlines, right?
Right.
It's about a much broader economic and cultural impact.
Exactly. And I think that's really what we need to dig into today.
Yeah, for sure.
So one of the most interesting things I came across was this report by Tourism Economics,
Okay.
and they're now projecting a 5.5% decrease in inbound travel for 2025,
Oh, wow.
which is wild because their previous forecast was for a 9% increase.
Yeah, so they're saying like a drop of 5.5% instead of a 9% growth.
Yeah,
That is a massive swing.
it really is, and it makes you wonder what's driving such a huge shift.
Yeah. So what are they saying are the main factors behind this change?
Well, one of the big ones they highlight is the increased potential for like escalating tariff and trade disputes.
Okay.
And they're estimating that this could actually lead to an $18 billion reduction in tourism revenue annually.
$18 billion. That's hard to even fathom.
It's a staggering number.
Yeah, it really is. So where are we seeing the biggest impact of these trade tensions, like right now?
So the data you guys sent in, it really seems to point to Canada as kind of a canary in the coal mine.
Okay, yeah, Canada's our biggest source of international tourists, right?
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that we're seeing this like very direct link between policy changes and tourist behavior.
Okay.
So right after the re-election, they slapped a 25% tariff on Canadian goods.
Right.
And almost immediately, you see this huge plummet in border crossings from Canada.
Wow.
I mean, we're talking about declines of up to 45% on some days compared to last year.
45%. That's not just a little dip, that's like a full-on exodus.
Yeah, it's pretty dramatic.
And I'm guessing the airlines are starting to feel the pinch too, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, Air Canada has already started cutting flights to popular U.S. vacation spots like Las Vegas.
Makes sense.
And these reductions, they're starting in March.
So pretty soon?
Yeah, and they're citing a decrease in demand as the reason.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like they're just doing this out of the blue, right? They're reacting to what they're seeing in their booking numbers.
Exactly.
So fewer Canadians crossing the border, fewer flights available for those who do want to come, and the polls that you sent seem to back this up too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So there was this Ledger poll from March.
Okay.
And it found that a whopping 36% of Canadians who had already made plans to travel to the U.S. have now canceled their trips.
Wow.
And then there's this OAG data that shows a 70% drop in flight bookings from Canada to the U.S. compared to last year.
70%. That's a huge drop.
Yeah, it's not just people talking about being hesitant. It's actually translating into real changes in travel behavior.
Yeah, and the U.S. Travel Association is starting to get pretty worried about this too, right? I mean, they're talking about some serious economic consequences if these Canadian visitors don't come back.
Oh, yeah, they're definitely sounding the alarm.
So what kind of impact are they predicting?
So they're estimating that even a 10% decline in Canadian visitors, and, we might already be past that,
Right.
could lead to a $2.1 billion loss in spending and put 140,000 hospitality jobs at risk.
Wow. So this is about way more than just tourism dollars.
Exactly. It has a ripple effect throughout the entire economy.
Yeah, and it's not just hitting major cities either, right? I mean, these tourism dollars are spread out all across the country.
Absolutely impacting small towns and rural communities as well.
Okay, so we've got these very real economic factors at play, but the data you sent also points to something a little less tangible, but maybe just as important, and that's the overall political climate.
Yeah, it seems like for some potential travelers, it's not just about the money.
Right.
There's this sense that the U.S. just isn't as welcoming as it used to be.
Yeah, and what are they saying specifically? Like, what are their concerns?
So some of the things that keep coming up are, this perception of harsh rhetoric towards foreigners, migrants, and the LGBTQ plus community.
Okay.
And even the Tourism Economics Report directly links these cancellations to what they call polarizing Trump administration policies and rhetoric.
So it's not just about higher prices, it's also about how the U.S. is perceived globally.
Right. It's about the overall image and whether people feel welcome and safe.
Yeah, and that brings us to Western Europe, which, as you mentioned, makes up a pretty big chunk of our overseas
And
visitors.
a significant 37% last year.
So what kind of trends are we seeing over there?
Well, there seems to be a growing reluctance to travel to the U.S., and it's driven by a couple of things.
Okay.
So firstly, the potential for higher prices due to the tariffs is definitely a concern, especially for budget-conscious travelers. But it goes beyond that.
Okay.
There's also this perception of the U.S.'s stance on the conflict in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
Some see it as leaning towards Russia, and that's definitely hurting the U.S.'s image.
Yeah, and the polls from Europe really reflect that shift in perception.
Absolutely. So this March YouGov survey found some pretty eye-opening numbers.
Okay.
In Britain, the unfavorable view of the U.S. is at its highest point since 2016, with 53% expressing an unfavorable opinion.
Wow.
And it's even higher in Germany at 56%, Sweden at 63%, and Denmark at a whopping 74%.
Wow, so this isn't just a blip on the radar. This is like a significant change in how the U.S. is viewed.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that sentiment is turning sour.
And it's not just these general feelings either, right?
Yeah.
The data you sent also highlighted some specific incidents that could be contributing to this sense of a less welcoming environment.
Right, so there have been these high-profile border incidents that have gotten a lot of international attention.
Like what kind of incidents?
Well, there was the detention of a British woman for over 10 days in March because of a visa issue. And then there was that report of a Canadian tourist being held in chains for 12 days.
What? That's pretty alarming.
Yeah, and these kinds of stories, they really stick with people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you're thinking about traveling to a new country and you hear stories like that, it's definitely going to make you think twice.
Absolutely. It creates this image of unpredictability and potential mistreatment.
Okay, so we've talked about Canada and Western Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about Mexico? They're our second largest source of tourists, right?
That's right. And the trends there are also pretty concerning.
Okay, so what are we seeing with Mexico?
So during Trump's first term, there was already a 3% decrease in visits from Mexico.
Okay.
And more recently, air travel from Mexico was down 6% this February compared to February of 2024.
So it seems like that downward trend is continuing.
Yeah, and potentially even accelerating.
And do we have any insights into what might be driving that?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but you have to wonder if things like specific trade policies or the rhetoric around immigration are having a bigger impact now.
Yeah, that makes sense. So across all of our major tourism partners, Canada, Western Europe, and Mexico, we're seeing these signs that point towards a potential decline.
Right, and it seems like this is already prompting some concrete actions from those countries.
Okay, like what kind of actions?
Well, countries like Canada, the UK, and Germany have updated their travel advisories for their citizens who are planning to visit the U.S.
Oh, wow.
And they're specifically warning about the possibility of arrests or detentions at U.S. borders.
So these aren't just general warnings. They're specifically about the U.S.
Right, and that's a pretty big deal for governments to do.
Yeah, for sure. It shows that they're really concerned about the safety of their citizens.
Exactly.
And it's not just these general warnings either,
Yeah.
right? There are also some very specific alerts being issued for certain groups of travelers, particularly from Europe.
Yeah, so countries like France and Denmark have issued alerts specifically for transgender and non-binary travelers.
And what's prompting those alerts?
It's in response to the new U.S. visa regulations that require people to declare their biological sex.
All right. And that obviously creates a lot of challenges and potential risks for transgender and non-binary individuals.
Yeah, for sure. So it's not just a vague sense of unease. There are very real policy changes that are having a direct impact on how people feel about traveling to the U.S.
Exactly.
And it sounds like these concerns aren't just leading to cancellations, but also to people choosing to go to other destinations instead.
Yeah, we're seeing this pretty clear pattern of Canadians in particular opting for different vacation spots.
Like, where are they going?
Well, places like Bermuda are reporting a surge in bookings, and they're anticipating a 20% revenue boost.
Wow.
And European vacation rentals have seen a 32% jump for the summer, which suggests that Canadians are choosing to go across the Atlantic instead of south of the border.
So this is having a real impact, not just on the U.S. tourism sector, but also on these other destinations.
Absolutely. It's like a shift in the global tourism landscape.
Yeah, and speaking of global events, the data you sent also brings up this really interesting point about the 2026 FIFA World Cup.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one. And it's being co-hosted by the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, right?
Right.
So what's the concern there?
Well, the worry is that the current visa and entry restrictions, along with this overall perception of the U.S. being unwelcoming, could really disrupt things for both fans and athletes.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, it's a massive global event, and you want people to be able to travel freely and easily.
Exactly. And if they can't, it could not only impact tourism revenue directly associated with the World Cup, but also damage the U.S.'s reputation as a host for future events.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's not just about the immediate impact, it's about the long-term consequences as well.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's try to bring all of this together.
Yeah.
It sounds like we're looking at a potential downturn in U.S. tourism for 2025. And it's not just based on a hunch. It's driven by a mix of economic policies like these tariffs and this shift in how the U.S. is perceived globally.
Yeah, that's a great summary.
And we're already seeing real-world effects, fewer border crossings from Canada Airlines changing their routes because of less demand, and booking data that clearly shows people are choosing to go elsewhere.
Exactly.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is, like decisions about trade and immigration and the overall political rhetoric. They all have a direct impact on something like the tourism industry.
It's a perfect example of how changes in one area can create these ripple effects across other areas on a global scale.
Yeah, and what's striking to me is just how quickly these shifts can happen.
Right.
Like the tourism industry is so sensitive to these changes in policy and perception.
It really is, and it underscores how important it is to understand these dynamics and their potential consequences.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a wake-up call in a way, right?
Absolutely.
So with all these trends we've talked about, the projected decline, the impact of tariffs, the shifting global sentiment, the diversion of tourism,
Yeah.
it kind of leads to a final question for our listeners. In this era of rapid political and social change, what do you think the future of global travel and destination popularity is going to look like?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And how do you think countries are going to have to adapt their policies and their approaches to attract and keep international visitors in this constantly changing world? Something to think about for sure.
Definitely a lot to consider.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. It's been a really thought-provoking discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, keep those questions coming. We'll see you next time.
See you later.